Well, good evening, everybody. This is True Seeker here, and as you can tell by my surroundings, I'm on a business trip, and I had a few minutes tonight to be able to get a couple of things that I've been thinking about recorded. Hopefully, I can talk about these in a relatively short amount of time. But it has to do with some of the things that I have been thinking about. My whole life was surrounded by the Bible students. My grandparents on both sides of my family, even my great grandparents. I knew my great grandmother. I knew my maternal great grandfather and my maternal great grandmother. On my grandmother's side, and they were the ones that had been introduced to the Bible students by the ship's purser on the Columbia. It was the steamship Columbia. I think it was a British line. Sometime around 1906, the purser of the ship was a Bible student, and they were moving to Brooklyn, and he mentioned, this was 1909, not 1906. My grandmother was 6. That's where the 6 comes in. And they were moving to Brooklyn, and the Bethel had, or the work that had been done in Allegheny at the Bible House had moved to the Bethel in Brooklyn. They bought actually properties that had been originally owned by Harriet Beecher Stowe. That's really kind of an interesting legacy. They knew about this property and they bought it. And she was a very well-known abolitionist that wrote, I believe it was Little Women. And I'm going to check myself on that. I'm going to fact check myself because I don't want to be wrong. Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she was, let's see, Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm sorry. That was probably the most influential book of the 19th century was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And anyway, she had owned a property in Brooklyn, and that the Bible students had purchased this. She was very influential in the abolitionist movement and the cause to free the slaves before the Civil War began. And you know, the Civil War played a very critical role in the shaping of religion in the 19th century, especially millennialism, and a special brand of independent uh, Protestantism that was unique to America. America at the time was ripe for religious, let's say, people gravitating to religion because of the significance of the profound effect that the Civil War had on individuals. If you question me on this, check out David Blight, who gave a lecture series. He was a Yale historian and specialist in the Civil War. We used to listen to his lecture series, and he talked about especially the effect of the war and the deaths that the number of deaths that both sides that were inflicted upon both sides, North and South. People had a profound effect on the individuals who wanted to contact loved ones and see the loved ones again. And the Bible students had a doctrine that you would see your loved ones again. This was what Russell taught, that God had a plan, and that part of this plan was to allow humanity to experience the exceeding sinfulness of sin, and that the human race would then benefit by this experience, and then would contrast that to the resurrection in the 1,000-year kingdom, when everybody would get a chance to see their loved ones again. Now, remember when Russell began his interest in the Bible, which was around 1870, 1880s, and there were still a lot of individuals alive that lived through the war, that lost loved ones or were impacted very heavily in some way from the war. A tremendous number of casualties. There are estimates that I've heard that reach as high as 1 million deaths attributed to the Civil War. Most statistics that I've read put it in the 600 to 700,000 men killed. But when you consider that the North had an army of about 2 million men and the South about half that, that is about 1/3, a little less than 1/3, maybe a quarter of all the men that fought in the war were killed, and the casualty rate was much higher, and that was because weapons were deadlier, and people, were fighting old-fashioned tactics with more deadly weapons, newer weapons, rapid fire guns. They had invented the Gatling gun. They had invented repeating rifles and revolvers, and they had rifles that were deadly at 800 yards. And these guys were still fighting Napoleonic tactics, where armies literally marched up to one another in lines, and they were cutting one another down with these guns. And the population of the United States as a whole was no more than 30 million people at the time. The greater part of that population was in the North. A greater part of the industrialization was in the north. Um, the south was still agrarian, largely. The larger part of the population, there were about 4 million slaves. There were about 9 million that lived in the South. So 1/3 of the country's population lived in the South, but the about half of that, a little less than half of that, were slaves, and the slave owners and many of the people that lived in the South were afraid of tremendous uprising, and they didn't they didn't want to shake things up. They wanted the status quo. Their livelihoods, their whole economy was based on the slave labor that they were getting, the free labor. It was free. They were not paying. I mean, they had to feed and clothe, but they were doing the bare minimum of that. The slaves were living horrific lives, and it's a terrible, terrible period of our history. But when you think about what happened in the Civil War and the tragedy and the deaths and the horrific number of everybody knew somebody who was killed in the Civil War. There was a significant rise. I think Blight indicated that during the 4 years of the war itself, there was only a handful of books published on religion and the afterlife, and I think he claimed 8 books. And then in the 1870s alone, there were over 80 books published on the afterlife, and some of them were quite bizarre, where they would get very descriptive about what heaven was like, and being able to find your loved ones in heaven, and holding out all these hopes. And Russell was one of these cranks that got involved in this and rode that wave of religious interest. And it wasn't only just religion. There was an increase in occultism. That's why it carried over. It spilled over into the 20th century. And Houdini spent quite a bit of time debunking spiritism and the occult as a fraud. But these people were making a lot of money trying to put the dead loved one in contact with people, and this was all as a result. This all grew out of the Civil War, and I urge you to hear what David Blight had to say. It's a fascinating lecture series that he gives, and he also offers up a lot of reading material. I frankly haven't had the opportunity to read many of the things that he recommended, but that was a college course, and I don't have the time to do an intense study of everything. Like when you're in college, your whole life is dedicated to the work that your professors put you to task to complete. But I just don't have that time. But it's fascinating to hear, because then you kind of get the idea and the setting of what transpired and why Russell began to have some success in the late 1870s and the early 1880s in attracting individuals to his special brand of religion. And I think most cruel was the prospect of you're going to see your loved ones again. And this is something that everybody suffers, because we all have loved ones. If we live any length of time, somebody very dear to us is going to pass away. And I remember my grandfather, how lonely he was in his 90s. He was almost 94 when he passed away. His siblings he had outlived all his siblings. He had, except for his half sister, he had outlived most of his friends. He most of his acquaintances and the Bible students were passed on. His whole generation were they passed away, and he was alone, and he was grieving in that loneliness. And my grandmother, having she did outlive him, but she had lost her mind to Alzheimer's, and very badly, and so he had lost her too. And this hope that he had in the kingdom, that the kingdom would remedy all of these things, that he would see his friends, that he would see his loved ones, and in particular his mother. Now, my grandfather's mother, when he was 12, my grandfather was born in 1899. My maternal grandfather was born in 1899, and my great-grandmother died when he was 12 of tuberculosis. They didn't have a cure for tuberculosis at that time, and he was the second youngest of four boys, and it really hit them very hard, because he was at a very sensitive age. Being 12 years old and losing your mother was devastating to him. And his father, my great-grandfather, married a second time, and she was a very kind woman, very nice woman, who was willing to take on four boys to raise. And she never had been married before, but she was Catholic, and they were Protestant. And believe me, back in those days, there was very little tolerance. There was a tremendous amount of animosity between Protestantism and Catholicism in this country, and so she was not accepted by any of my grandfather or his siblings. He felt some guilt later on in life about that, because he realized what a challenge it was that she took on. But his hope was to see his mother again. He was devastated that he lost his mother, and apparently he was very, very close to her. And it impacted him so that as an 87-year-old man, I can remember one of my grandfather's last talks that he gave as an elder in the New York Ecclesia. He talked about his favorite doctrine of the Bible students. It was probably the only doctrine he really put any stock in and really hoped was true, was the doctrine of the resurrection, so that he could see his mother again. And when he had talked about his mother and his hope to see her in the resurrection, he broke down and cried. He was so deeply impacted by her death, and so taken in by this doctrine and this false hope that it gave him to have this hope that he'd see her again, that he had broken down and cried. He hadn't coped with her death. It had a profound impact on him his entire life. Now he passed away at almost 94, just months shy of 94 years old. But that was something that was a lifelong thing with him since his mother had died. That's what drew him into the truth. That's why he bought into the religion, because he wasn't he was a smart man. I mean, he rose through the ranks to a very high position in one of the biggest banks in New York during the middle 20th century, and he worked under William Howard Taft II. He was the nephew of the president, William Howard Taft, and my grandfather knew some very powerful people, the blue bloods of New York society, like the Roosevelts. He knew Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt, through the banking circles, and called him Archie. Took me through Sagamore when I was 14 to see the home, and they had photographs of the Theodore Roosevelt's family, and he would point out Archie for me. And my grandfather was a pallbearer at William Howard Taft II's funeral, and he knew these people. I checked online, and there are all these bank records of his bank dating back into the 20s and 30s, and they had a board of directors with very influential names. Kennedy was one of them, and there was he moved in some very U.S. aristocratic circles, old money, 19th century money. These were the captains of industry during the 19th century, and these were the subsequent generation who took the money that they inherited and went into banking. It's kind of like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who built the empire first with boats. They called them Commodore Vanderbilt, and then with the railroad system, New York Central, and became the wealthiest person of the mid-19th century. And when he passed away, his son William took all of that inheritance and became a banker. And that's what happened with a lot of the children of these very wealthy 19th century capitalists and entrepreneurs. And for example, the Rockefellers, many of them went into politics and other pursuits because they had the money to do it. And my grandfather rose from obscurity. We didn't come from many, family background ties, money, and he worked his way up into those circles. I once found a photograph of my grandfather, and that I got from my grandfather. He was attending a banking seminar Washington, D.C., and the wives of these bankers, top bankers of New York, went to the White House, and they were all gathered together, and here's President Kennedy addressing the wives of these bankers, and they were standing out there with their overcoats. I could pick out my grandmother in this photograph, but there was Jack Kennedy, and it was toward the end of his presidency. It was not too long before he was um, um, assassinated. Now, the fascinating thing to me is that I never even knew that they had even done this, because, for one thing, they didn't like the Kennedys because they were Catholic, and secondly, they made their money in alcohol, and thirdly, they didn't like his politics. They were more conservative, and even though the Bible students weren't supposed to have political leanings, many of the Bible students that they moved in the circles of were probably the better off Bible students, and had more money, were formed sort of an elite little club or clique, and tended to be more on the conservative side. If you had a conservative political element in the Bible students, they would have been it. And my grandfather made quite a few Bible students wealthy, relatively wealthy, by giving tips as to what to invest in, and that was his specialty in the bank, was investments and property investments and such. And so a lot of Bible students profited in that, but that, I think, was what kept him in the Bible students, was this hope of the resurrection. And it's a devastating thing. I mean, this is something that's both the Bible students and the Jehovah's Witnesses have in common, is this teaching, this doctrine that you'll get to see your loved one if you just believe what we have to say and stick around with us. We'll guarantee that all the problems will be solved in the kingdom. Defer the problems, like my brother and his mental condition and the suicidal tendencies. And my grandfather, he was well into his 90s, but he would acknowledge that my brother was in dire straits, but he would say he needs the kingdom so badly. My parents, who were in a position to be able to do more, being my brother's parents, could have intervened a little more, looked to see what they could have done, but were firmly believed that his only hope was the kingdom, so they didn't even try. We tried. We had our own issues at the time. We were struggling to survive, my wife and I, in a tough environment, and I was in college, and my brother obviously was going through a very, very difficult period, as he had a marriage that fell apart. He had a tragic death that he was involved in with his best friend, it was a lack of judgment. They were using alcohol, and they took an old boat out in a lake. The water temperature was just above freezing because the lake had just thawed, and they turned the boat over, and his friend couldn't swim, and he drowned. And my brother survived, and all these tragic things happening in his life had a irreversible his use of drugs. Some of them were quite powerful, LSD, mind-altering drugs, and experiences that just destroyed his will to live, and his marriage broke down, and there wasn't much I could do at the time. When we had more opportunity, we had an open door for him, and we tried to encourage him to come over as much as he could.